Richard Nixon was known for many things. One of those was his love for secretly recording conversations.
You see, homosexuality, immorality generally, these are the enemies of strong societies. That's why the communists and the left-wingers are pushing each other. They're trying to destroy us.
Believe it or not, that's the guy who started the culture war. Perhaps one of the most annoying parts of modern-day political rhetoric is the culture war. It's everywhere. In political speeches, ads, and on the totally objective news networks that exist to support them. Yet, for something that gets talked about so much, it can be kind of hard to put your finger on exactly what it is. What it feels like is a kind of cyclical phenomenon where a prevalent person or thing in society is suddenly deemed inappropriate or offensive, or canceled, if you will. That's kind of a definition, right? But regardless of what the culture war actually is, or who its victims are, everyone knows who's getting the blame for it. Because seemingly everyone agrees that the left, hi, that's us, is trying to take something away from average Americans. Average Americans like this guy. This is Al. And this whole culture war thing, it makes Al pretty frustrated. So he watches and listens to angry YouTubers and podcasters who sell him brain pills and half of your friends from high school, and they're all in agreement that cancel culture has gone too far. They've taken yet another random thing away from us. Now, let's just ignore the merits of that argument for a second, because underlying all of this cultural lament is something deeper. It's a genuine belief that things were once better, or at the very least, better for some people. People like Al. So while Al watches I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry by himself and grumbles to his Facebook friends about how they can't make movies like this anymore, he's not just angry at a bunch of politically correct Hollywood liberals. He's also telling himself a story about our history. A story that's largely made up. Because despite Al's Facebook posts to the contrary, the culture war isn't new. And it most definitely isn't liberal. The spring of 1968 remains one of the most tumultuous seasons in our country's history. It's also, quite possibly, the birthplace of our beloved culture war. It began on Sunday, March 31st. President Lyndon Johnson is giving an address to the nation on failed peace talks in Vietnam. But before signing off, Johnson announces to a shocked nation that he will not seek another term in office. He had served out just a single year of Kennedy's term and 4 years of his own, but in that time he'd overseen a dramatic era of liberal governance and ultimately a legacy-destroying period of escalation in Vietnam. So, with no end to the deeply unpopular war in sight, Johnson steps aside to allow his party to find a new nominee. It was still the early days of spring, and the days ticked on. On Monday, the series finale of The Andy Griffith Show premiered to an audience of 15 million. On Tuesday, director Stanley Kubrick premiered his new film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And on Wednesday, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to a gathered audience in Memphis, Tennessee.
And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
It's a Thursday, just 5 days after Johnson's announcement, and Martin Luther King is standing on the second-floor balcony of his hotel in Memphis.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Later that night, in the midst of his run for the Democratic nomination, Bobby Kennedy, now a senator from New York, speaks to a crowd gathered in Indianapolis.
What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
Kennedy, of course, couldn't have known the role he'd come to play later that spring. Just 2 months later, mere hours after winning the California primary, Bobby was shot in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Now, if you're starting to wonder what the hell this has to do with Al sitting at home watching I Now Pronounce You Chuck and Larry and doing spit takes every time Adam Sandler and Kevin James have to kiss, we're getting there, I promise. The presenting sponsor of Crooked History is Demz, the first of its kind investment fund that, through extensive research, ensures you're only investing in S&P 500 companies that donate over 75% of their contributions to Democratic causes and candidates. You can finally put your money where your vote is. Search for the DEMZ ticker, that's DEMZ, wherever you invest, or visit demz.fund to learn more. Carefully consider the fund's investment objectives, risk factors, charges, and expenses before investing. This and additional information can be found in the fund's summary or full prospectus, which may be obtained by visiting demz.fund. So, spring of '68 was bad, but not just the normal kind of bad. People were scared. Up until '68, most white Americans could just go about their suburban lives, scarcely thinking about the problems of literally anyone else. But that spring had changed things dramatically. By election season, 94% of American homes had TVs in them, and every night those TVs brought them images of war, of protests, of black people crying out in anguish, of women demanding rights. There were assassinations and riots, and so many people wanting rights that if you hadn't seen anything like that, and no one ever had, you'd probably be scared shitless. And so they were. And while the Democratic Party may have missed the signs, the Republicans certainly hadn't. Enter Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon had served as vice president for 8 years in the Eisenhower administration before running for president himself in 1960. But despite his years serving under a popular incumbent, Nixon lost to newcomer John F. Kennedy in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Your high school history teacher probably taught you that Nixon's disastrous televised debate performance brought about his defeat. And that certainly played in. But Nixon's loss had a lot more to do with the Kennedy coalition of black voters, organized laborers, and white Catholics, the last of which had largely abandoned the Democratic Party in the 50s. All of that to say, by 1968, Richard Nixon was no stranger to losing presidential elections. So he decided to switch up his strategy.
When a nation has been known for a century for equality of opportunity is torn by unprecedented racial violence, and when the President of the United States cannot travel abroad or to any major city at home without fear of a hostile demonstration, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America.
His new strategy was simple. As the Democratic Party became increasingly young and progressive and black, the Republican Party would go after white Democrats in the South and offer them a new home in a party that stood against the rioters that they had seen on TV all spring and summer. Nixon promised law and order. He promised to quell the riots, to end the war, to return to Eisenhower's calmer and whiter America. Nixon's campaign hit at growing fears in white America and exploited them at every possible turn.
This time, vote like your whole world depended on it.
Because you see, Nixon, for all his faults, was perceptive. His promise of law and order gave solace to white America, and in exchange, they gave him the presidency. The problem for Nixon, though, was that not every election season would be as dramatic and terrifying as 1968. And he still had another election to win. So when the 1972 election rolled around, and there wasn't a slew of assassinations and riots, Nixon decided to stir up his own drama.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Nixon's war on drugs, alongside his surgically perfected Southern strategy, was stunningly effective. When all was said and done, Nixon won re-election with 520 electoral votes to 17. It is worth wondering, if Nixon had lost the election, would the Republican Party have turned away from the culture war? Would they have watched the way he attacked and vilified black voters, the way he criminalized drug use and drug users, the way he began to call his political opponents the enemy? Maybe if they had seen all that paired with defeat, things would have been different. But that's not what happened. It worked. The Republican Party was permanently changed. We all know what happens next. Watergate. Nixon's legacy is destroyed, Gerald Ford trips a lot, and Jimmy Carter gives up his peanut farm, but then along comes Reagan. He's charming and funny, and he's got some strange ideas about taxes. But he's running a campaign packed to the brim with culture wars. He pitches his campaign as anti-abortion, anti-queer, and anti-drugs. He paints Carter as weak, soft on terror, and fiscally irresponsible, and the country buys it. It's the Nixon campaign with a better frontman. And in 1984, when re-election rolls around, Reagan surges to an even greater electoral win than Nixon had, 525 to 13. Go Minnesota. So Bush Sr. tries it in 88. Clinton sees how well it works, and he gives it a swing too. W does it even better than his dad. McCain seems to actively try to avoid the low-hanging fruit, but hey, birtherism happened anyway because old Nixon with a head injury shows up. And watching from his couch, our old friend Al cheered him on. Al was angry, and he hadn't realized why, but now he saw it. It was all the immigrants and the queer people and the feminists and the black people and the Clintons and the liberals. But now he was also hopeful that finally someone in politics would speak for him. So he smiled and listened and donated and liked and reposted as Donald Trump campaigned on the backs of all the culture warriors who'd come before him.